Hello, this is Jerry Morton. Welcome to my Finding My Way podcast. This is podcast number 61, titled Introduction. Podcasts 34 through 61 are stories from the year of Army training I experienced. The training started in August 1966 and ended in June 1967. The stories are published in the book Reluctant Lieutenant, From Basic to OCS in the 60s, which was published by Texas A&M University Press as a military history. Podcast 61, Introduction, is the introduction to the Reluctant Lieutenant book written by G. Kurt Piehler. Dr. Piehler provides an excellent review of the historical development of the military draft system in the United States into the Vietnam era, as well as important demographics concerning the Vietnam era draftees. It is recommended that you listen to the Army training stories in the order in which the podcast numbers present them, so that you can appreciate the full contextual richness of this introduction. Introduction by G. Kurt Piehler. Until the First World War, the United States relied on volunteers to fill the ranks of the armed forces. In the 19th century, the U.S. Army generally had little difficulty finding enough immigrants, African Americans, and displaced workers to serve in the enlisted ranks. When larger armies were needed in major conflicts, citizens, spurred on by patriotic fervor, flocked to join the locally raised U.S. volunteers. When the initial euphoria slackened, bounties and other inducements often succeeded in prodding young men to fight. Only during the Civil War, after the casualty rolls mounted, did conscription become necessary to raise an army. Both the Confederate States of America and the U.S. government adopted a draft with mixed success. In the case of the Confederacy, conscription served primarily to ensure that those who had enlisted voluntarily earlier in the war remained in uniform. The Union Army raised few new recruits through conscription and succeeded in provoking the worst riot in American history. In July 1863, it took Union troops, fresh from their victory at the Battle of Gettysburg, to fully suppress the New York City draft riot. In the 20th century, America relied on conscripts to fight the world wars and limited wars in the Cold War era. During the First World War, President Woodrow Wilson and the U.S. Congress abandoned the traditional reliance upon the U.S. volunteers system for raising a wartime army, and the Congress, after considerable debate, adopted a selective service system. Opponents of conscription questioned whether compulsory military service remained constitutionally permissible or militarily necessary. Wilson and other advocates of conscription countered by insisting all male citizens of a republic were obligated to serve their country in time of war, although not necessarily on the battlefield. They insisted that a selective service system offered a more equitable and rational way to allocate the manpower necessary to wage total war. At the same time, the Wilson administration supported conscription in order to prevent such political opponents as former President Theodore Roosevelt from raising volunteer regiments. The United States raised a large army to fight in America's first major overseas war, but there remained a significant amount of draft resistance, especially in the rural South. All white draft boards in the South often discriminated against African Americans. In many communities, blacks were disproportionately drafted into the Army to fill quotas. Many business owners believed the federal government should use the threat of the draft to foster labor peace and prevent wartime strikes. Not surprisingly, organized labor vehemently opposed efforts to use conscription to curb the rights of workers to organize and bargain collectively. After the armistice in November 1918, the United States returned to a volunteer army. However, the precedents established regarding the draft would shape how Franklin D. Roosevelt's administration raised an army to fight against Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. Even before the United States entered the Second World War, Roosevelt prodded Congress to enact peacetime conscription in 1940. During the war, over 10 million men would be drafted into the military, with another 6 million joining voluntarily. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor and the German declaration of war had served to unite the country. Although national conscription had much broader support than in either the Civil War or the First World War, there still remained differences over how it should be administered. Who should be exempt from military service? Despite the pleas of educators, few blanket exceptions were granted to college or graduate students. In contrast, there remained substantial public support to offer exemptions to farmers, essential war workers, and fathers with young children, especially pre-Pearl Harbor fathers. Victory against Germany and Japan in 1945 did not lead to an end of conscription, except for a brief interruption from 1947 to 1948. Even when, in the late 1940s, President Harry S. Truman pruned defense spending and relied on atomic weapons for national security, the draft remained the principal means by which the military filled the ranks, especially in the case of the Army. Conscription not only fed draftees to the military, it also provided a major incentive by encouraging voluntary enlistments. Several Defense Department studies conducted in the early 1960s show that just over a third of new enlisted men indicated that the prospect of being drafted had spurred them to sign up. By enlisting, a young man could better determine his fate by picking a more desirable service, which for many was either the Navy or Air Force. In the case of physicians, the possibility of conscription into the enlisted ranks served as an inducement to encourage these and other vital medical personnel to apply for commissioning and thus enjoy the benefits of officer status while practicing their profession. From its inception, supporters of conscription believed it should be used to channel manpower to vital defense occupations. The total wars of the 20th century required the mobilization of the entire economy and, as a result, key defense workers during the World Wars and the Cold War received draft exemptions. During the late 1940s and 1950s, there remained significant support both among educators and the general public for exempting college and graduate students from the draft. A widespread consensus developed among federal officials, the business community, and academia that the United States must produce more scientists, engineers, and educators to prevail against the Soviet Union technologically. The successful launch of Sputnik in 1957 only heightened concern among policymakers of the need to strengthen the country's educational infrastructure. As America's longest war, the war in Vietnam required a substantial number of men to fight it. Our involvement in Indochina dated back to the Second World War, when the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, provided limited logistical assistance to Ho Chi Minh and his forces in their fight against the Japanese, who had occupied Vietnam with the permission of the Vichy French government in 1941. Although initially reluctant to endorse French efforts to retain Indochina as a colony immediately after World War II, by 1950, the United States was committed to support France's military campaign to defeat Ho Chi Minh. Not only did the United States underwrite the French effort financially in the early 1950s, it also began to send military advisors to the war. When the French decided to pull out of Vietnam after being defeated at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, the United States decided to support the creation of a viable non-communist regime in South Vietnam. Although the administrations of Dwight D. Eisenhower and John F. Kennedy initially hoped to confine their support of South Vietnam to military hardware and economic aid, the number of military advisors steadily increased, especially during the early 1960s. American involvement in the Vietnam War must be seen in the context of the larger Cold War. When John F. Kennedy assumed the presidency in January 1961, he embarked on a major buildup of both nuclear and conventional military forces. In the view of many of his defense advisors, a substantial conventional capability remained essential to make nuclear deterrence credible, especially in Europe. Even after the United States escalated its involvement in Vietnam, it still maintained massive commitments outside of Indochina. To support the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, the United States deployed over 500,000 troops on the European continent. The U.S. Navy maintained a global naval presence, as well as substantial strategic nuclear capability through a fleet of Polaris submarines. The U.S. Air Force devoted substantial personnel and resources for a high level of readiness for the Strategic Air Command and its force of land-based strategic weapons. During the Vietnam War era, 8.7 million men, the majority of those in the armed forces, never saw service in Indochina. Only slightly more than a third, 2.7 million men, served in country, and another 600,000 were stationed at air bases in Thailand or Guam or on naval vessels off the coast of Vietnam. Many myths surround the Vietnam War. Without trying to minimize the impact or significance of the anti-war movement, there remained significant political and public support for American intervention in Indochina, especially in the early 1960s. Many Americans shared Kennedy's vision that the United States must fight the spread of communism throughout the world. The United States, during the early part of the Cold War, provided military and economic aid to countless Third World nations seeking to suppress communist insurgencies. In the Western Hemisphere, the Kennedy administration in 1961 sought to overthrow the government of Fidel Castro in a Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, sponsored invasion by Cuban exiles. A year later, President Kennedy compelled the Soviet Union to remove nuclear weapons from Cuba through diplomatic pressure and the enforcement of a naval quarantine around the island. When Lyndon B. Johnson escalated American involvement in Vietnam in 1964 and 1965 in order to prevent the collapse of the South Vietnamese government, few major public figures publicly dissented. For example, in 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution authorizing the Johnson administration to intervene in Vietnam to repel North Vietnamese aggression unanimously passed in the House of Representatives. Only 2 members of the Senate voted against the wide-ranging resolution. Many in Congress and the wider public accepted the arguments advanced by the Johnson administration and its supporters concerning the threat posed by the collapse of South Vietnam and how it could lead to a domino effect, with emboldened communists going on to seize Cambodia, Thailand, Malaysia, and the rest of Asia. In retrospect, we know a significant amount of dissent remained within the Johnson administration, Congress, and the military regarding the wisdom of escalating American involvement. Why so little open dissent? The legacy of McCarthyism cannot be discounted. Johnson and many in Congress remembered how Senator Joseph McCarthy, Republican, Wisconsin, and other right-wing critics had taken Truman to task for losing China in the late 1940s. Historians even disagree over Johnson's own commitment to the war. Although some have portrayed his decision to escalate U.S. involvement as inevitable, others are less certain. Most biographers of this complex president agree that the Great Society was LBJ's first love, in that he remained strongly committed to building a domestic reform agenda that would rival Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. His critics, both at the time and since, have faulted Johnson for trying to have both gun and butter because of the damaging consequences for the economy. Moreover, LBJ is criticized in many quarters for not having fully mobilized American society for the Vietnam War. For example, he only reluctantly agreed to raise taxes to pay for the war's cost. Moreover, there remained only a limited mobilization of reserve and National Guard units. Jerry Morton's memoir says little about ideology or patriotism as a motivation for joining the military. This was not unique to the Vietnam War era. During the Second World War, social scientists surveying American troops found that small group loyalty served as the essential force that motivated men to fight. For most combatants, an unwillingness to let their buddies down proved more important than patriotism, support of democratic principles, or even hatred of the enemy. Those who read soldiers' memoirs, letters, and oral histories from the Second World War, Korea, or Vietnam will often find that most servicemen and women focus the majority of their daily attention on such mundane matters as food, weather, access to creature comforts, relationships with friends and comrades, and personal survival. During the period in which Jerry Morton served in the Army, there was still significant support for the war, even on many college campuses. As George Flynn has observed, the majority of college students between 1964 and 1970 told posters they agreed with the U.S. decision to intervene in Vietnam. Not until after the Tet Offensive in the spring of 1968 did support for the war begin to wane among national elites and the general public. Even after Tet, the majority of Americans were reluctant to leave Indochina unilaterally. In 1968, Richard M. Nixon won election to the presidency, pledging that he would achieve peace with honor. Not until the early 1970s did lack of support for the war prod Congress to begin placing restrictions on U.S. involvement in the war, most notably limiting the use of American ground troops in Cambodia. Even then, most Americans wanted out of Vietnam not because they viewed it as an immoral war, but because it was not working. The war in Vietnam was a long war, and when Jerry Morton entered the service in 1966, the armed forces were expanding rapidly, growing from 2.6 million in 1965 to 3.5 million by 1968. Moreover, manpower policies required the continuous flux of new personnel. In contrast to the Second World War, U.S. Army troops during the Vietnam War rotated home after a fixed tour of duty for either reassignment or discharge, just as they had during the Korean War. Volunteers served in the Army for 3 years, but draftees only had to remain in the service for 2 years. Not only did the military, especially the Army, need enlisted men, they also had to train scores of new junior officers. Jerry Morton's memoir suggests that this rapid buildup was not without problems. The Army, especially at basic training facilities, groaned under the weight of processing so many new recruits. The baby boom of the post-World War II era had ensured a large draft pool. In 1955, the draft pool numbered 21,641,000, but by 1964 it had grown to 29,519,000. Proportionately, fewer men of draft age were required to perform military service compared to either the Korean War or during the late 1950s. Although a smaller percentage of the eligible male population was drafted, conscription provoked considerable public debate in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Many questioned the fairness and effectiveness of the selective service process. Many claimed that conscription imposed an unfair burden on the poor, the working class, and minority groups. In the aftermath of the Vietnam War, both intellectuals and politicians on both the left and right have argued that Americans' cultural elites did not have to share the burden of this conflict. Jerry Morton reminds us that there remained a significant number of college-educated men who served during the Vietnam era as a result of conscription. In his accounts of basic training at Fort Dix, New Jersey, and advanced infantry training at Fort Anniston, Alabama, Morton describes the divisions that existed between those with college degrees and those with only a high school education or less. Statistically, Morton was not unique for his level of education. As George Flynn observed in The Draft, large numbers of college men did serve in the Vietnam era. Quote, in 1964, for males aged 27 to 34, only 41% of those with an 8th grade or lower education served in the military. High school dropouts served at a 70% rate. High school graduates at 74%. College dropouts at a 68% rate. College graduates at a 71% rate. By late 1967, the relative proportions were as follows: 60% of high school graduates, 50% of non-high school graduates, and 40% of college graduates saw duty. End of quote. Morton's memoir is an invaluable reminder to the non-veteran that Army service required a number of skills and abilities. During the Vietnam War era, the military continued to reject a substantial number of men as unfit for the military. For example, Flynn writes that in 1964, slightly over half of all draftees inducted to the armed forces were rejected as unsuitable for military service. The poor and those without high school diplomas had a higher rejection rate for military service than did inductees who had completed high school or attended some college. Moreover, the Army that fought in Vietnam was better educated on average than the one that fought in the Second World War. In Vietnam, 80% of all soldiers possessed a high school diploma, but in the Good War, only 45% of men possessed that credential. Morton is also conscious that there were those with political connections who escaped the draft and were able to join the National Guard. In his memoir, he recalls the disdain he and his fellow soldiers had for members of the Guard contingent at Fort Anniston. Although a significant number of middle and upper-class Americans avoided services in Vietnam, many did not. As in the World Wars and Korea, the officer corps during the Vietnam War remained disproportionately the preserve of men holding college degrees and of middle-class backgrounds. Many officers never made it back home. In the case of the Army, they represented 13.5% of those killed in Vietnam. There remained inequities. In contrast to both the Second World War and the Korean War, the majority of Vietnam-era veterans were volunteers. But during the height of American involvement in the war, draftees bore a disproportionate share of the fighting. As Jerry Morton recalls with great honesty, he, like many young men of his generation, volunteered for military service in order to avoid being drafted into the Army and assigned to an infantry unit. Although Morton volunteered with the expectation that the Army would use his skills as a psychologist in the Adjutant General Corps, when he arrived at boot camp, he learned that things would not go according to his original plan. Most soldiers during the Second World War and the Korean and Vietnam Wars never experienced combat. Modern warfare is dependent upon a vast network of support personnel. For example, during the Second World War, less than a third of Army personnel were assigned to combat arms. During the Vietnam era, the percentage of troops in combat specialties had declined to 14% by 1971. In popular culture, we tend to focus on the experiences of those who serve on the front lines. During the war itself, the role of the Green Beret gripped the popular imagination. Several novels, a popular song, and even a Hollywood movie starring John Wayne featured the exploits of the Army Special Forces. As Charles Musakis observed in The American Enlisted Man, the Green Berets deployed in Vietnam never numbered more than 4,000. Except for the Green Berets, it would not be until the aftermath of the Vietnam War that novelists in Hollywood would grapple with the experiences of the average U.S. serviceman and woman who served in Indochina. In the late 1970s and 1980s, novels and motion pictures focused on the alienation and mistreatment of the average grunt. Most Vietnam-era veterans were not grunts. Moreover, as B.G. Burkitt notes in his book Stolen Valor, the majority of Vietnam veterans were more like Jerry Morton than the shattered wrecks of men depicted in such films as The Deer Hunter and Rambo. Morton's memoir also reminds the reader that the senior leaders in Vietnam were men who had fought in the Second World War in Korea. Both the senior and non-commissioned officers and the colonels and generals in this conflict were men whose military careers had begun in what has commonly been perceived as a good war. Since America's withdrawal from the war in 1973 and the collapse of the South Vietnamese regime in 1975, Vietnam has continued to evoke significant debate. Morton's tone is remarkably free of rancor or ideological cliches. His memoir does, however, raise some important issues for both historians and the general public about the war and its aftermath. Did the Army adequately train the men who fought in Vietnam as officers and enlisted men? Morton also recounts an Army that has not existed since 1973. A generation has passed since the last draftees reported for basic training. Morton offers an unsentimental look at how the conscript army worked. Those who advocate abandoning the all-voluntary military and resuming conscription should carefully consider his memoir.